The most expensive mistake you will ever make is believing that character can be measured by a first impression. Victoria Hayes glanced at her watch for the third time as she stood outside one of Dallas's most exclusive restaurants, wondering whether agreeing to a blind date had been a rare lapse in judgment. The evening air carried the soft hum of luxury cars passing beneath glowing city lights, while elegantly dressed couples disappeared through polished glass doors. She had built one of America's fastest-growing automotive companies by making decisions quickly, trusting observation over emotion, and refusing to waste time. Tonight, however, she hoped her closest friend, Melissa Grant, had finally introduced her to someone different. Melissa smiled as she welcomed Victoria inside. "He should already be here," she whispered confidently. Victoria nodded politely before following the hostess toward a quiet corner table. There sat Ethan Carter, wearing a faded blue button-down shirt with sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, well-worn work boots, and an inexpensive wristwatch scratched by years of honest labor. A folded drawing made by a child rested carefully beside his glass of water. He stood immediately with a warm smile. "Victoria, it is nice to finally meet you." His voice carried quiet confidence without the slightest hint of arrogance. Victoria returned the greeting courteously, but something inside her immediately pulled away. She had expected polished tailoring, expensive accessories, and the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to executive boardrooms. Instead, she saw a man who looked more like a mechanic finishing a long workday than someone introduced as her ideal match. Melissa noticed the hesitation almost instantly. Leaning closer, she quietly murmured, "I honestly thought he would at least dress for the occasion." Ethan pretended not to hear, offering both women menus before thanking the server with genuine kindness. Small conversations followed naturally. Ethan spoke about raising his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, about never missing Saturday breakfast together, and about believing that success meant always having someone excited to see you come home. Victoria listened politely, yet her attention continued drifting toward appearances rather than words. When Ethan mentioned spending most of his days restoring old automobiles, Melissa exchanged another skeptical glance with Victoria. "So you fix cars?" Melissa asked with a faint smile that sounded more judgmental than curious. Ethan nodded comfortably. "Something like that." He offered no further explanation. Victoria looked toward the large front windows where city lights reflected across the sidewalk. She had spent years avoiding relationships built on assumptions, yet she suddenly realized she was making one herself. After only 20 minutes, she gently placed her napkin beside her plate and offered an apologetic smile. "I am sorry, Ethan. I have an early meeting tomorrow morning. I should probably leave." Ethan never argued. He simply stood respectfully as she gathered her purse. "Thank you for coming," he said sincerely. "I hope you have a safe drive home." Victoria nodded politely before walking toward the restaurant entrance beside Melissa, convinced she had just avoided another disappointing evening. Behind them, Ethan quietly reached for the child's drawing resting on the table. Across the bottom, written in colorful crayons, were the words, "Best Dad Ever." He smiled softly before folding it into his wallet. Outside, the valet attendants suddenly straightened in surprise as several breathtaking supercars rolled slowly toward the entrance one after another beneath the brilliant lights, and neither Victoria nor Melissa had the slightest idea that every single one of them belonged to the quiet single father they had just left sitting alone. Ethan Carter never noticed the line of astonished faces near the restaurant entrance because his attention had already shifted to something much more important. He thanked the server for the meal, carefully slipped Lily's colorful drawing back into his wallet, and quietly settled the dinner bill before standing to leave. The young valet hurried toward him carrying a polished leather key case with both hands. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," he said respectfully. "Your collection has just arrived from the exhibition transport company. They asked where you would like each vehicle delivered." Ethan smiled politely. "Please have them sent to the restoration workshop. I only need my pickup tonight." The valet blinked in surprise. "Not the Ferrari?" Ethan shook his head. "My daughter has a school project tomorrow morning. The pickup has her backpack in the back seat." At almost the same moment, Victoria and Melissa stepped onto the sidewalk, still discussing the disappointing evening. Melissa laughed quietly. "You really dodged a bullet. Nice enough guy, but clearly not your world." Victoria gave a small nod without answering. Before either woman reached the parking area, the sound of powerful engines rolled gently through the street. One by one, a beautifully restored Ferrari, a classic Lamborghini, a silver McLaren, and a rare Porsche entered the valet circle beneath the restaurant lights. Every vehicle gleamed like a museum masterpiece rather than an ordinary automobile. Guests paused to admire them. Several people instinctively reached for their phones. Melissa whispered, "Someone very important must be arriving." Then both women watched the valet walk directly past the exotic cars and hand the leather key case to Ethan. Instead of choosing any of the supercars, Ethan accepted only a single pickup truck key, thanked every driver transporting the collection, and spent several minutes personally checking each automobile before asking that they be taken safely to his workshop. His movements reflected familiarity rather than excitement. He treated every priceless machine with the same calm respect a craftsman might show a favorite set of tools. Victoria frowned slightly. "Does he work for the owner?" she asked. One of the transport drivers overheard the question and smiled. "No, ma'am. Mr. Carter owns every one of them." Melissa stared in disbelief. "Every one." The driver nodded proudly. "He also owns Carter Heritage Restorations. Collectors from all over the country trust him with cars worth millions of dollars because nobody restores them better." Victoria remained silent as Ethan climbed into the old blue pickup truck instead of any exotic vehicle. The worn truck quietly pulled away while the convoy of supercars followed behind toward another destination. Melissa finally spoke again. "Why would someone who owns all of those drive that?" The transport driver answered before either woman could continue wondering. "Because he says expensive cars are beautiful to admire, but old pickup trucks are better for taking his little girl to school every morning." The convoy disappeared beneath the city lights, leaving Victoria standing motionless on the sidewalk. For the first time that evening, she realized she could not remember a single question she had asked Ethan about the person he truly was. She had noticed his shirt, his boots, and his old truck before she ever noticed his quiet confidence, his kindness toward strangers, or the pride in his voice whenever he spoke about Lily. As the night air settled across downtown Dallas, Victoria quietly looked toward the empty street where Ethan had disappeared, carrying an unfamiliar feeling that had nothing to do with regret alone. It felt like the uncomfortable realization that the quickest decision of her career might also have been the least accurate. Victoria Hayes had always believed that success came from making difficult decisions before hesitation had the chance to become weakness. By 39, she had transformed Hayes Automotive Group into one of the most respected luxury automotive companies in America. Every morning began before sunrise inside her downtown Dallas penthouse, overlooking a skyline slowly illuminated by the first golden light of day. Her calendar was planned weeks in advance, every meeting timed to the minute, every investment carefully evaluated. Board members admired her discipline. Investors trusted her judgment. Business magazines praised her ability to read people almost instantly. Yet very few understood where that confidence had come from. Years earlier, she had trusted the wrong business partner, someone who appeared polished, successful, and generous while quietly hiding dishonesty beneath an expensive suit. That experience had convinced her that first impressions often revealed everything a person wanted others to see. Ironically, she never realized that the lesson had slowly become a weakness rather than a strength. The morning after the blind date, Victoria sat quietly inside the executive conference room while senior executives presented quarterly performance reports. Charts filled enormous display screens. Profit margins exceeded expectations. New dealership partnerships continued expanding across the country. Normally, Victoria noticed every detail. Today, her attention drifted elsewhere. She kept remembering Ethan's calm smile after she apologized and left the restaurant. He had shown no anger, no embarrassment, and no attempt to impress her. He had simply wished her a safe drive home. During a short break, Melissa walked into Victoria's office carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You have been unusually quiet today," she observed with a teasing smile. Victoria accepted the coffee without looking away from the city below. "Have you ever made a decision too quickly?" Melissa laughed. "Every successful executive does." Victoria slowly shook her head. "I'm not talking about business." Melissa immediately understood. "You are thinking about Ethan." Victoria remained silent for several seconds. "Did you know anything about him before introducing us?" Melissa hesitated. Only that someone said he was a wonderful father. Victoria looked toward her friend. Nothing else. Melissa shrugged lightly. Honestly, I assumed the rest after seeing him. Those words echoed inside Victoria's thoughts long after Melissa left the office. I assumed the rest. They sounded painfully familiar because they described exactly what she had done. She had noticed faded clothing before kindness. She had noticed worn boots before quiet confidence. She had noticed simplicity before character. Late that afternoon, curiosity finally replaced certainty. Victoria opened her laptop and typed only 3 words into the search bar. Ethan Carter, Dallas. Hundreds of articles immediately appeared. None described a struggling mechanic. Instead, headlines praised one of the nation's most respected classic automobile restoration specialists. Interviews featured collectors trusting him with rare Ferraris, vintage Lamborghinis, and priceless American muscle cars. Industry publications referred to Carter Heritage Restorations as the gold standard for preserving automotive history. Yet nearly every photograph showed Ethan wearing the same simple work clothes she had seen the previous evening, smiling beside grease-covered tools rather than expensive suits. Victoria quietly closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. For the first time in years, she realized she had not misjudged someone's financial success. She had misjudged something far more valuable. She had mistaken humility for failure, simplicity for limitation, and quiet dignity for a lack of ambition. As the Dallas skyline slowly disappeared beneath the colors of sunset, Victoria understood that the story she thought had ended after one disappointing dinner might only have been beginning. The following Saturday arrived with bright Texas sunshine stretching across quiet suburban streets, while Ethan Carter followed the same routine he had never allowed success to change. Before most of Dallas had finished breakfast, he and 8-year-old Lily were already walking through the spacious restoration workshop that had become their second home. The enormous building echoed softly with the sounds of polished tools, classic engines, and friendly conversations between skilled craftsmen who greeted Ethan not as a wealthy owner, but as a respected teammate. Lily skipped happily between beautifully restored automobiles, carefully carrying a tray of fresh coffee and homemade muffins she insisted on sharing with every employee. "Good morning, Mr. Ben," she called cheerfully. "Dad says nobody restores chrome like you." The older technician laughed warmly. "Your father is much too generous." Ethan smiled while rolling up the sleeves of his faded work shirt before kneeling beside a partially restored 1967 Mustang. He spent the next hour polishing a small chrome trim piece with the same patience another artist might dedicate to a priceless painting. One of the younger mechanics approached carrying a clipboard. The collector from California offered another $3 million for the Ferrari collection if you were willing to sell. Ethan barely looked up from his work. "Tell him thank you, but those cars belong here for now." The mechanic nodded without surprise. Everyone already knew Ethan rarely made decisions based only on money. Later that morning, Victoria parked quietly across the street from the workshop after following the address she had discovered through her research. She had not come to confront Ethan or explain herself. She simply wanted to understand the man she had judged so quickly. Through the open workshop doors, she watched him laugh with employees, patiently teach a teenage apprentice how to restore delicate body panels, and pause everything when Lily ran toward him holding a slightly crooked wooden birdhouse she had just finished painting. Ethan accepted it as though she had presented him with the finest trophy in the world. "This is beautiful," he said sincerely. Lily frowned playfully. "One side is a little crooked." Ethan smiled. "That makes it unique." Victoria remained completely still behind the windshield. She had attended countless executive meetings where million-dollar negotiations lasted only minutes. Yet she had never witnessed someone with Ethan's resources devote an entire morning to repairing old cars, encouraging young employees, and celebrating a child's handmade gift with such genuine joy. Melissa suddenly called her phone. "Have you talked to him yet?" Victoria quietly answered, "Not yet." Melissa sighed. "You are actually considering another chance." Victoria watched Ethan help an elderly customer into a chair before personally explaining every detail of a restoration project without mentioning prices or prestige. "I am considering whether I ever gave him a first chance." She ended the call and continued watching in thoughtful silence. Just before leaving, Ethan noticed an elderly delivery driver struggling to unload several heavy boxes. Without hesitation, he crossed the parking lot, lifted every package himself, thanked the driver for making the trip, and returned to work without drawing attention to what he had done. Nobody applauded. Nobody recorded the moment. It simply reflected who he was when he believed no one important was watching. Victoria slowly started her car, carrying with her a growing realization that the rarest quality she had ever searched for in another person had been sitting across the dinner table only days earlier, hidden beneath a faded blue work shirt, an old pickup truck, and a humility so genuine that it never once tried to introduce itself. Monday morning unfolded beneath a clear Texas sky as Victoria Hayes found herself thinking about Ethan Carter far more often than she expected. Every business meeting seemed strangely quieter than usual because her thoughts kept returning to the restoration workshop, the old pickup truck, and the little girl whose smile had lit up an entire building filled with priceless automobiles. For the first time in years, Victoria questioned whether she had spent too much of her life evaluating resumes instead of character. That afternoon, she quietly asked her executive assistant to gather more information about Carter Heritage Restorations. The report arrived within hours, but instead of focusing on revenue or market value, one section immediately caught her attention. Every year, Ethan funded a vocational scholarship program for teenagers who could not afford technical education. He personally hired many graduates, believing that skilled hands deserved opportunities regardless of family income. Another page described how he quietly restored classic vehicles for military veterans and local museums at little or no profit. There were no press releases celebrating those decisions, no interviews, no carefully crafted publicity campaigns. Victoria closed the folder and whispered to herself, "Why did nobody ever tell this story?" Her assistant smiled gently, perhaps because Mr. Carter never tried to. Across town, Ethan remained completely unaware that anyone was investigating his life. His attention stayed exactly where it always belonged. After finishing work, he arrived at Lily's elementary school just in time for the annual family science fair. Children proudly displayed handmade volcanoes, solar system models, and carefully painted posters while parents wandered through the gymnasium offering encouragement. Lily stood beside a simple project, explaining how different engine designs improved fuel efficiency, complete with tiny hand-painted cars she and Ethan had built together from recycled wood. When the judges stopped at her table, Lily smiled confidently. "My dad taught me that every machine works better when people take care of the little details." Ethan quietly applauded from the back of the room, far more interested in seeing Lily's confidence than whether she won a ribbon. She earned second place and ran straight into his arms as though she had won the entire competition. "I told you we could do it," she laughed. Ethan proudly held up the small blue ribbon. "This belongs on the refrigerator." As father and daughter left the school, Victoria happened to arrive nearby for a charity board meeting hosted in the same community center. She recognized Ethan immediately but remained several yards away, watching unnoticed as he knelt beside Lily to help her tie one loose shoelace before opening the pickup truck door for her. They laughed together over something only the two of them understood, completely unaware that anyone was observing. Victoria realized she had attended countless elegant galas filled with influential people, yet she could not remember seeing many moments as genuine as the one unfolding in an ordinary school parking lot. She started walking toward them, then stopped. This was not the right moment. Ethan deserved more than an apology spoken because guilt demanded it. He deserved honesty spoken when humility had finally replaced pride. As the old pickup disappeared down the quiet suburban street beneath the warm colors of sunset, Victoria made a silent promise to herself. The next time she stood in front of Ethan Carter, she would not be meeting the man she imagined on the night of their blind date. She would finally meet the man who had been there all along. The next Saturday morning arrived with crisp autumn air drifting through Dallas as Victoria Hayes finally decided that waiting any longer would only make her apology feel less sincere. Instead of arranging another formal dinner or asking an assistant to contact Ethan, she drove alone to Carter Heritage Restorations wearing simple jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable shoes rather than her usual executive attire. She wanted nothing to distract from the conversation she had rehearsed in her mind all week. When she stepped inside the workshop, she immediately recognized the familiar sounds of honest work. The gentle rhythm of polished tools echoed across the spacious building while sunlight poured through high windows, illuminating rows of beautifully restored automobiles that reflected decades of craftsmanship. Ethan stood beside an unfinished classic Chevrolet, carefully guiding a young apprentice through a delicate repair. "Take your time," he said with patient encouragement. "The goal is not to finish first. The goal is to finish right." The apprentice smiled gratefully before trying again with steadier hands. Only after the lesson ended did Ethan notice Victoria standing quietly near the entrance. His expression showed surprise, but never discomfort. He walked toward her with the same calm smile he had worn during their first meeting. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I did not expect to see you here." Victoria took a slow breath. "I did not expect to be here either, but I needed to come." Ethan nodded politely. "Would you like some coffee?" She smiled faintly. "I would like the chance to say something first." They moved toward a small wooden table overlooking the workshop floor, where employees continued working without interruption. Victoria looked directly at Ethan, refusing to hide behind carefully chosen business language. "I judged you before I ever gave myself the chance to know you. I noticed your clothes instead of your character, your truck instead of your values, and your silence instead of your kindness. I have spent every day since then realizing how wrong I was." Ethan listened without interrupting, his attention completely focused on her words. When she finished, a quiet silence settled between them before he answered gently. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. "I do not expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know that I regret the way I treated you." Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than wounded. "The interesting thing about restoration," he said while glancing toward the classic cars surrounding them, "is that people often look at something old or imperfect and decide its value before understanding its story. Sometimes the greatest mistake is not what they see. It is what they never stop long enough to discover." Victoria smiled softly. "That sounds like it applies to more than automobiles." Ethan laughed quietly. "Usually it does." Before either of them could continue, Lily ran into the workshop carrying a paper bag from a nearby bakery. "Dad, I remembered your favorite cinnamon rolls." She stopped suddenly after noticing Victoria. Ethan smiled. "Lily, this is Victoria." Lily offered a cheerful wave without hesitation. "It is nice to meet you." Victoria smiled back warmly, surprised by how naturally the little girl welcomed a complete stranger. Lily placed the warm pastries on the table and proudly announced, "Dad says Saturdays are better when people eat together." Ethan looked at his daughter with amused affection before turning back toward Victoria. "Would you like to stay for breakfast?" For the first time since leaving that restaurant several days earlier, Victoria realized she was finally being invited into the real life of the man she had almost walked away from forever. Breakfast inside the workshop quickly became one of the most unexpected mornings Victoria Hayes had experienced in years. Instead of discussing quarterly earnings, luxury markets, or expansion strategies, the conversation centered around cinnamon rolls, school projects, and Lily's determination to convince her father that every classic automobile deserved a cheerful nickname. Ethan laughed as Lily proudly pointed toward a beautifully restored 1965 Mustang. "That one is Captain Blue because he always looks brave." Victoria smiled despite herself. "Does every car have a name?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "Dad says if someone spends years bringing something back to life, it deserves to be remembered." Ethan gently shook his head with amused embarrassment. "She remembers every conversation. I hope she forgets." Victoria looked around the workshop again, noticing details she had overlooked during her earlier visit. Young apprentices worked beside experienced craftsmen without fear of asking questions. Older technicians patiently demonstrated techniques that took decades to master. Nobody hurried. Nobody competed. The atmosphere felt more like a family than a business. One teenage apprentice approached Ethan carrying a small metal component with an uncertain expression. "I think I ruined it," he admitted quietly. Ethan examined the part for only a moment before smiling reassuringly. "No, you learned something valuable." The young man looked confused. Ethan placed the component back into his hands. "Perfection is not where great craftsmanship begins. Patience is." The apprentice returned to his work with renewed confidence. Victoria watched the exchange in thoughtful silence. She had spent years leading thousands of employees, yet she realized how rarely encouragement required complicated speeches. Sometimes it was only a few honest words delivered at exactly the right moment. After breakfast, Lily asked whether Victoria wanted to see her favorite place inside the workshop. Without waiting for an answer, she led her toward a quiet corner where dozens of framed photographs covered one wall. Victoria expected pictures of award-winning automobiles and celebrity collectors. Instead, she found smiling families standing beside restored vehicles that had once belonged to grandparents. Military veterans receiving cherished cars returned to original condition, and young scholarship graduates proudly holding certificates beside Ethan. A small handwritten plaque rested beneath the photographs. Every vehicle carries memories. Every restoration protects a family's story. Victoria slowly traced the words with her eyes before turning toward Ethan. You could have filled this wall with awards. Ethan smiled softly. Awards remind people what you accomplished. Those photographs remind me why I started. Before Victoria could answer, an elderly couple entered carrying a homemade apple pie wrapped carefully in a checkered towel. The woman embraced Ethan warmly. Our grandson was accepted into your scholarship program, she said with grateful eyes. We wanted to say thank you. Ethan accepted the pie with genuine appreciation. He earned that opportunity himself. The elderly man shook his head. Maybe, but you were the one who believed he deserved it. They exchanged a few more quiet words before leaving. Victoria stood motionless, absorbing another simple act of gratitude that Ethan accepted without seeking recognition. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the workshop windows, she realized the impressive collection of automobiles parked inside the building no longer seemed like the greatest treasure surrounding him. The greatest treasure was the trust reflected in every employee, every customer, every family, and every child who walked through those doors believing they would be treated with dignity. Looking toward Ethan, Victoria quietly understood that true success was never parked beneath polished lights inside a showroom. It was found in the ordinary moments when one person's quiet character gave countless others a reason to believe in themselves. Over the following weeks, something neither Ethan Carter nor Victoria Hayes had expected quietly began taking shape. There were no dramatic declarations, no extravagant gifts, and no carefully staged moments designed to impress one another. Instead, trust grew through ordinary afternoons that somehow became unforgettable. Victoria occasionally visited the restoration workshop after finishing executive meetings, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes simply sitting beside Lily while she completed homework at a small wooden table near Ethan's office. Lily quickly stopped thinking of Victoria as an important business leader. To her, Victoria became the grown-up who always remembered extra-colored pencils, never complained about getting paint on expensive shoes, and somehow knew how to explain difficult math problems without making anyone feel embarrassed. One bright Saturday morning, Ethan invited Victoria to attend the annual scholarship presentation held inside the workshop. Dozens of young men and women stood proudly beside restored automobiles while families filled rows of folding chairs decorated with simple blue ribbons. There were no television cameras, no reporters, no celebrities. Ethan stepped onto the small platform wearing the same faded blue work shirt he always preferred. He thanked his employees before thanking the students themselves. Talent deserves opportunity, he said calmly. Character deserves trust. If you work hard, remain humble, and never stop learning, there will always be someone willing to believe in you. The audience applauded warmly, but Ethan stepped away almost immediately, allowing every scholarship recipient to become the center of attention. Victoria watched quietly from the second row, realizing that he possessed something remarkably rare. He understood how to lead without needing to stand in the spotlight. After the ceremony ended, one young apprentice approached Ethan carrying an old toolbox with tears of gratitude shining in his eyes. Nobody else would even interview me, the young man admitted softly. You gave me my first chance. Ethan smiled gently. Someone once gave me mine. Now it is your turn to give someone else theirs someday. Victoria listened without interrupting. Those simple words stayed with her long after the applause faded. Later that afternoon, she and Ethan walked slowly through the workshop, while Lily happily sketched another classic automobile at a nearby workbench. Victoria glanced toward a beautifully restored Ferrari sitting beneath bright overhead lights. People probably assume those cars are your greatest achievement, she said thoughtfully. Ethan looked toward the scholarship students laughing together outside before answering. The cars are only machines. Watching people discover confidence they never believed they had is worth far more. Victoria smiled with quiet admiration. I spent years measuring success by growth charts and quarterly reports. Ethan looked at her kindly. Those things matter too. They create jobs, support families, and build opportunities. The question is what we choose to do with success after we earn it. His answer settled gently into her heart because it carried no judgment, only perspective. As evening approached, Lily ran toward them carrying 3 paper cups of lemonade. "Family break," she announced. Proudly, Ethan laughed while accepting one of the cups. Victoria accepted another, smiling at how naturally she now fit into moments that once would have felt unfamiliar. They sat together outside the workshop watching the warm Texas sunset paint golden reflections across rows of carefully restored automobiles. Expensive machines surrounded them, yet none of them seemed as remarkable as the quiet peace shared between 3 people who had slowly stopped seeing one another through appearances and had finally begun seeing one another through the far more enduring measure of character. One cool October afternoon, Ethan Carter received an invitation that surprised even him. Hayes Automotive Group was hosting its annual leadership summit, bringing together executives, engineers, apprentices, and scholarship recipients from across the country. At the bottom of the invitation, written in Victoria Hayes's own handwriting, were a few simple words. "I hope you and Lily will come." Ethan smiled quietly before placing the invitation on the kitchen table. Lily immediately picked it up and read it twice. "Does this mean we get to see Miss Victoria again?" she asked hopefully. Ethan laughed softly. "I believe it does." The following weekend they arrived at the company's headquarters just as the morning sun reflected across the modern glass building. Employees welcomed them warmly, not because Ethan owned an impressive collection of automobiles, but because Victoria had often spoken about the values she hoped the company would represent. Throughout the day, visitors toured engineering laboratories, restoration displays, and scholarship exhibits created by students whose education had been supported through partnerships between Hayes Automotive Group and Carter Heritage Restorations. Victoria guided Ethan and Lily through each exhibit with genuine pride. "This partnership has already helped more than 100 young people begin technical careers," she explained. Ethan smiled. "That is a much better investment than another sports car." Victoria returned the smile. "I learned that from someone who measures success differently." Later that afternoon, the audience gathered. Inside the main auditorium for the closing presentation, Victoria stepped onto the stage beneath bright lights while hundreds of employees quietly took their seats. She spoke about innovation, responsibility, and leadership before unexpectedly changing the direction of her speech. "Several months ago," she began calmly, "I believed experience had taught me how to judge people quickly. Then I met someone who reminded me that first impressions often reveal more about the observer than the person being observed." The room grew completely silent. Victoria invited Ethan onto the stage. Looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention, he reluctantly accepted only after Lily gently squeezed his hand with an encouraging smile. Standing beside him, Victoria continued, "Many people know Mr. Carter as one of the finest restoration specialists in America. I know him as the father who taught me that humility never announces itself. Kindness does not seek applause, and real success begins long before anyone notices it." Warm applause filled the auditorium, but Ethan simply waited for the room to grow quiet before speaking. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "If there is one thing I hope everyone remembers today, it is this. Expensive things can impress people for a moment. Honest character earns trust for a lifetime." His words lasted only a few seconds, yet they seemed to stay with everyone listening. After the presentation ended, employees gathered around to congratulate both of them, but the moment that mattered most happened away from the crowd. Lily slipped her small hand into Victoria's and smiled. "Dad was nervous." Victoria laughed gently. "I noticed." Ethan shook his head with amused embarrassment. "Standing in front of old cars is much easier than standing in front of people." They walked outside together beneath the warm afternoon sky where Ethan's old blue pickup truck remained parked beside several gleaming supercars. Victoria looked from the pickup to the collection of exotic automobiles before smiling knowingly. She no longer saw contradiction. She finally understood that the truck represented the life Ethan chose every day, while the supercars simply reflected the success that never changed who he was. In that quiet moment, surrounded by polished machines and ordinary conversations, Victoria realized she had stopped admiring Ethan because of what he owned and had begun admiring him because nothing he owned had ever managed to own him. Several weeks passed, and the quiet friendship that had begun inside a restoration workshop slowly became a natural part of everyday life. Victoria Hayes no longer measured her visits by the hours she spent away from the office, but by the memories she carried home afterward. Some evenings, she joined Ethan Carter and Lily for simple dinners on the back porch, where conversations wandered from school projects to favorite books, from old automobiles to dreams for the future. Nothing about those evenings was extravagant. Paper plates replaced fine china, homemade lemonade replaced expensive wine, and laughter always arrived before sunset. One Friday afternoon, Ethan received a call from the director of a children's community center that had partnered with his scholarship program for years. Their annual family fundraiser had lost its keynote speaker at the last minute. "Would you consider saying a few words?" the director asked hopefully. Ethan smiled. "If it helps the kids, I will be there." The following evening, families filled the community center gymnasium decorated with handmade banners and colorful drawings created by local children. Volunteers welcomed guests with warm smiles while teenagers demonstrated projects they had completed through vocational training programs. Victoria arrived quietly without announcing herself, choosing a seat near the back beside Lily rather than the reserved section prepared for local business leaders. She wanted to experience the evening through the eyes of the families whose lives Ethan had quietly influenced for years. When Ethan stepped onto the small stage, he wore the same faded blue work shirt he had worn during countless ordinary workdays. There were no dramatic introductions, only sincere applause from people who already knew his character. He looked across the audience before speaking. "Many people believe success begins when someone notices you," he said calmly. "I believe success begins when you notice someone who needs encouragement." The room grew wonderfully still. Ethan continued with the quiet confidence that had always defined him. "Every child deserves an adult who believes in their future before the world asks for proof. Every young person deserves an opportunity to learn a skill that creates dignity as well as income. If we spend our lives helping others discover what they are capable of becoming, then our own success will always have meaning." His words were simple, yet they settled gently into every heart listening. When he finished, the applause lasted much longer than he expected. Ethan smiled modestly before stepping away from the microphone, allowing scholarship students and volunteers to receive recognition instead. Victoria watched him from across the room, realizing once again that he never tried to become the center of attention. He simply made everyone around him feel more important. After the event ended, families gathered to thank Ethan, while children eagerly introduced him to grandparents and younger siblings. Lily stood proudly beside her father, smiling every time someone described how much he had changed their lives. As the crowd slowly dispersed beneath the warm glow of evening lights, Victoria walked over and stood quietly beside Ethan. "You never speak about yourself," she observed softly. Ethan looked toward the families laughing together outside. "They did not come here to hear my story," he replied. "They came because they are writing their own." Victoria smiled with quiet admiration. She finally understood that the greatest leaders were not remembered because they collected admiration for themselves. They were remembered because they inspired ordinary people to believe that their own lives mattered just as much. One quiet afternoon, several months after the blind date that had nearly ended their story before it truly began, Melissa Grant stood outside Carter Heritage Restorations with unusual hesitation. She had driven past the building twice before finally gathering the courage to park. The familiar workshop doors stood open beneath the warm Texas sun, while the steady rhythm of honest work echoed through the spacious building. Employees greeted one another with relaxed smiles. Apprentices carefully restored classic automobiles under patient guidance, and Lily sat at her favorite table finishing homework while occasionally looking up to wave at everyone passing by. Melissa remained near the entrance for a long moment before Ethan Carter noticed her. He walked over with the same calm expression he offered every visitor. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "It is nice to see you again." Melissa lowered her eyes for a brief moment. "I am surprised you even wanted to say hello." Ethan smiled gently. "Holding on to resentment takes energy I would rather spend somewhere else." His answer only made Melissa feel more humbled. She took a slow breath before speaking honestly. I came because I owe you something that should have been said a long time ago. Ethan quietly waited. The night Victoria and I met you at the restaurant, I judged you before I knew anything about you. I looked at your clothes, your truck, and your appearance, then decided who you must be. I encouraged Victoria to do exactly the same. Looking back now, I realize I was not seeing you at all. I was only seeing my own assumptions. The workshop seemed wonderfully quiet as her words settled into the afternoon air. Ethan folded his hands comfortably and nodded with understanding. Thank you for saying that. Melissa looked surprised. That is all. Ethan smiled softly. People make mistakes. Character is revealed by what they do after they recognize them. Tears quietly formed in Melissa's eyes. You are kinder than I deserve. Ethan shook his head. Kindness is not earned. If it were, none of us would receive enough of it. At that moment, Victoria entered the workshop carrying a box of educational materials for the scholarship students. She paused briefly after noticing Melissa, uncertain whether she had interrupted something important. Melissa turned toward her friend with a small smile filled with humility rather than pride. I finally apologized. Victoria looked toward Ethan. How did he respond? Ethan laughed quietly before answering himself. We had a conversation. Victoria smiled knowingly because she understood that Ethan never believed people should remain prisoners of their worst decisions. Lily walked over carrying 3 paper cups of fresh lemonade and cheerfully announced, Dad says difficult conversations are easier when nobody is thirsty. Everyone laughed together, and the remaining tension quietly disappeared. Later that afternoon, the 4 of them sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree outside the workshop, while apprentices continued working nearby. Melissa watched Ethan patiently helping a young student understand a difficult restoration technique before returning to join the conversation without ever mentioning the interruption. She finally understood why so many people admired him. It had very little to do with remarkable automobiles or financial success. It came from the quiet consistency with which he treated every person, regardless of who they were yesterday. As the sun slowly lowered across the Texas sky, Melissa realized the greatest lesson she would carry from that unexpected friendship was not about wealth, business, or first impressions. It was that the strongest people rarely prove others wrong by arguing. They simply continue living with such steady dignity that the truth eventually speaks for itself. As the final weeks of the year settled over Texas, Ethan Carter received an invitation to exhibit several of his restored automobiles at the National Heritage Motor Exhibition, one of the country's most respected gatherings for collectors, craftsmen, students, and automotive historians. Ethan accepted only after learning that all proceeds from the event's charity auction would support vocational education programs for young people across America. On the morning of the exhibition, the enormous convention center shimmered beneath bright winter sunlight, as visitors admired rows of beautifully restored classics representing generations of automotive history. Rare Ferraris stood beside vintage Mustangs, elegant Bentleys reflected polished ceiling lights, and collectors quietly discussed craftsmanship rather than price. Ethan arrived exactly as he always did, driving the same old blue pickup truck with Lily sitting happily beside him, while the carefully transported collection of supercars followed separately inside enclosed trailers. Victoria Hayes smiled as she watched the familiar scene unfold. She no longer found it surprising that the owner of some of the world's most admired automobiles still preferred the pickup truck carrying his daughter's backpack. Throughout the afternoon, visitors surrounded Ethan, asking detailed questions about restoration techniques, preservation methods, and the history behind each remarkable vehicle. He answered every question with patience, always inviting his apprentices to explain their own work whenever possible. They deserve the credit, he reminded every guest. They restored these cars with their own hands. Nearby, Victoria spoke with several young scholarship students who excitedly described how Ethan had changed their lives by believing in them before anyone else had. Listening quietly, she realized that every conversation somehow returned to the same qualities: humility, patience, respect, opportunity. As evening approached, organizers invited Ethan and Victoria onto the main stage to recognize their shared commitment to vocational education and community investment. Hundreds of guests filled the grand exhibition hall, while rows of gleaming automobiles reflected warm golden light across the polished floor. The host smiled warmly before asking a simple question. Mr. Carter, with everything you have accomplished, what achievement makes you most proud? Ethan looked toward Lily standing beside the stage with a bright smile before answering without hesitation. Watching my daughter grow into someone who treats people kindly. The audience became wonderfully quiet. Then the host turned toward Victoria. And what has been the greatest lesson of your own journey? Victoria smiled gently before answering. I once believed success could be recognized by appearances. Today I know that true greatness often arrives wearing ordinary clothes, driving an old pickup truck, and speaking more about other people than itself. Warm applause filled the exhibition hall. Ethan looked slightly embarrassed by the attention, but Lily simply smiled proudly, convinced the whole room had finally noticed what she had known all along. As the ceremony ended, families wandered peacefully among the beautifully restored automobiles while children admired engines that had been brought back to life through extraordinary craftsmanship. Yet the memory most visitors carried home was not the collection of priceless cars parked beneath brilliant lights. It was the quiet example of a humble father whose character had proven more remarkable than anything resting inside the exhibition hall. Victoria stood beside Ethan as they watched Lily laugh with scholarship students, and she quietly realized that the most valuable thing surrounding them that evening had never been made of polished steel, rare leather, or powerful engines. It had always been the simple dignity of a man who never needed the world to know how wealthy he was, because he had already become rich in all the ways that mattered most. I do not have the content of Part 12 or the story details needed to continue it consistently. Creating a continuation would require inventing characters, events, and timeline, which would not satisfy your requirement to remain consistent with the previous part.